The street went completely silent the moment those cars turned the corner. Not the kind of silence that happens when something ordinary passes by, the kind of silence that happens when something so unexpected, so entirely out of place, rolls into a neighborhood that has never once seen anything like it. First came a black SUV moving slow and deliberate, the way things move when they want to be seen. Then another one behind it. And then, right there in the middle of a street where children had always played on cracked sidewalks and screen doors slapped shut in the heat of the afternoon, a Rolls-Royce. White as fresh linen. Chrome catching the sunlight like a mirror. Moving so slowly through that narrow block that every person who stepped out of their house, every neighbor who pressed their face to a window, every child who froze mid-step on the sidewalk, had time to look. Time to wonder. Time to whisper to the person next to them, "Who is that?" Because nobody who grew up on this street had ever come back to it in anything that even approached this. Nobody who had ever left this neighborhood had returned like this. And the woman inside that car, sitting in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a single house at the end of the block, had not left this neighborhood. She had been driven out of it. By the very people who were supposed to love her most. 11 years ago, she had walked away from this street in the dark, with a single bag on her shoulder and $28 to her name, and not one person in that house had come to find her. Not her mother. Not her sisters. Not one soul. And now she was back. Not because she owed them anything. But because she had decided, after 11 years, after everything she had survived, after everything she had built, that the only way to truly be free was to walk back through the fire one last time and lay it down. What she did next would be talked about on this block for years. And whether you think you would have done the same thing in her position, that is the question this story is going to ask you. Because by the end, you are going to have to answer it honestly. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments right now where you are watching from. Drop your city, your country, wherever you are in the world, because stories like this one reach people everywhere and we love knowing who is in this community with us. And if you are new here and you have not yet subscribed, please do that right now. Click the subscribe button so you never miss any of the stories we put out, because they are stories that stay with you. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand who that woman was sitting in the back of that Rolls-Royce, you have to understand who she was before any of this. And that story begins in a small house on the east side of Atlanta, Georgia, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of March, when a baby girl came into the world and her mother named her Raina. Raina Denise Holt. Raina was the first child born to Gloria Holt, a woman who was 23 years old, working a cashier job at a grocery chain, living in a rented house that sat between a tire shop and a coin laundry on a block that smelled like exhaust and fried food in the summer. Gloria was not a bad woman. That is important to say up front, because this story does not work if we make her a monster, because monsters are easy to understand and Gloria Holt was not easy to understand. She was a complicated woman shaped by her own complicated history, raised by a mother who showed love through provision rather than affection, who bought groceries and kept the lights on but never once sat on the edge of a bed and asked how a child was feeling inside. Gloria had inherited that emotional language, or rather, she had inherited the absence of it. And in ways she probably never examined clearly, she passed that absence directly onto her oldest daughter. Raina came first and she was a quiet baby who observed everything, wide dark eyes taking in the ceiling, the light, her mother's face hovering above her. And Gloria looked back at that face and felt something she could not have named if she tried, something between love and distance, something that kept her from fully falling into the connection that first children are supposed to unlock in their parents. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't indifference in the deliberate sense. It was more like a window with a film of dust on it, the light came through but nothing was quite clear. 2 years later, Gloria gave birth to her second daughter, Shanice. And something shifted. With Shanice, the film on the window was gone. Gloria laughed easier. She sang in the kitchen when Shanice was on her hip. She bought little ribbons for Shanice's hair on grocery runs that she never once thought to buy for Raina. Reina was 3 years old and she watched this shift the way small children watch things that confuse them, without language for what she was seeing but with a body that understood every bit of it. She learned early that certain spaces in the house were warmer than others. She learned which rooms her mother's laughter lived in and which rooms it did not enter. And she learned, in that wordless way that children learn the things that hurt them most, that she was not quite in the center of her mother's world. She was more like a satellite, circling, watching, never quite landing. 3 years after Shanice came Destiny, the youngest. And with Destiny, if anything, Gloria opened even further. Destiny was a bright-eyed, round-cheeked little girl who cried dramatically and laughed louder, who wrapped herself around Gloria's legs at every available opportunity and said, "Mama," like it was the only word she needed. And Gloria received every single bit of it. She was in Destiny's corner completely. She told Destiny she was beautiful every morning before school. She sat on the floor and did puzzles with her. She kissed the top of Destiny's head when she walked past her in the hallway. Small things. Ordinary things. Things that should have been available to all 3 of her daughters equally and simply were not. Reina grew up watching her sisters receive what she could not access, not from lack of trying, but from some structural truth about how this family was arranged that nobody had ever sat down and explained to her, because there was nothing to explain. It was just the way things were. She was the oldest. She was expected to be capable. She was expected to handle things. She woke before her sisters on school days and made herself breakfast and packed her own bag while Gloria got Shanice and Destiny ready. She came home from school and started the dishes without being asked. She folded laundry on Thursday evenings because she had noticed that it piled up and no one else seemed bothered by that. She swept the kitchen floor. She took out the trash. She was the girl who held the household together in all the quiet, unglamorous ways that go entirely unnoticed when they are happening and only become visible when they stop. And not once, not one single time, did Gloria sit her down and say, "Reina, thank you for all of this. I see you working hard. I see you carrying more than your share." Not once. What she said instead, when she said anything at all, was, "You're the oldest. You know better." As if being the oldest was both the explanation and the punishment. As if the accident of birth order was sufficient justification for every imbalance that had been allowed to grow inside that house. And how does this make you feel? As you're listening right now, maybe you're driving, maybe you're at home, maybe you're lying in bed with earphones in, how does it feel to hear about a little girl who cleaned and cooked and held everything together and received nothing back but the expectation to keep doing it? Does it remind you of anyone? Does it remind you of yourself? Because the truth is, Reina's story is not as rare as it should be. The world is full of people who grew up as the invisible one, the capable one, the one who was never allowed to be the one who needed things. And if that is you, this story was made for you to hear. By the time Reina was 12, the dynamic inside the Holt house had calcified into something permanent and unquestioned, the way an old injury calcifies into bone and just becomes part of the structure. Shanice and Destiny were exempt from most household responsibilities because Gloria managed their time differently. She enrolled them in activities, drove them to practices, attended their events, hovered over their homework. Reina was left to her own academic devices, which turned out to be considerable, because Reina Holt was sharp in the specific, dangerous way that children who spend a lot of time alone tend to become sharp. She read everything she could get her hands on, she thought carefully before she spoke, she asked questions that made her teachers pause. Her 7th grade English teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Dunmore, once held Reina back after class and told her that her essay on perseverance was the best piece of student writing she had read in 11 years of teaching. She said, "Reina, you have something in you that most people don't develop until they're much older. You have the ability to feel something deeply and then translate it into something other people can understand. That's a gift. Don't let anyone convince you it isn't." Reina thanked her and went home and told no one, because there was no one to tell. She folded the compliment up somewhere inside herself like a piece of paper she was saving for later. At home, the mockery had become a regular feature of life with her sisters. Shanice was 12 by then and Destiny was 9, and both of them had grown up inside a system that implicitly told them that Raina was beneath them in the family hierarchy, not through anything said out loud, but through 11 years of watching their mother's behavior teach them the lesson of who mattered and who didn't. Shanice was the one who delivered it most directly. She had her mother's sharpness of tongue and none of the instinct to restrain it. She called Raina the maid when she wanted to be cruel. She said it casually at the dinner table one Thursday evening, the way you say something you have been thinking for a long time and finally decide you might as well say out loud. Can you pass the salt, maid? And Destiny, who was 9 and didn't fully understand the weight of it, laughed. And Gloria, who heard it from the kitchen doorway, said nothing. She turned back to the stove. She said nothing. And Raina sat at that table and felt something happen inside her that she didn't have the word for yet. She would find the word years later, in a therapist's office in a city 1,000 miles away. The word was erasure. The systematic, daily erasure of a person's right to exist as someone who matters. And it had been happening to her since before she was old enough to understand it. The incident that finally broke everything open happened on a Wednesday evening when Raina was 16 years old. It had been a long week. Raina had a math exam that morning that she had studied for until midnight the night before, sitting at the kitchen table under the one good overhead light because the lamp in the bedroom had burned out weeks ago and Gloria had not replaced it. She'd gotten what she was almost certain was the highest grade in the class. She came home from school that afternoon and found the house a mess, dishes from that morning still in the sink, Destiny's backpack exploded across the living room floor, a bag of chips left open on the couch. She started cleaning without being asked, the way she always did, moving through the rooms quietly and systematically. She was halfway through the dishes when Shanice came into the kitchen, grabbed a soda from the refrigerator, looked at Raina's back, and said, "You missed a spot on the counter." Just like that. No acknowledgement that Raina was cleaning the kitchen that Shanice had helped dirty. No thank you. No awareness that a person with feelings was standing at that sink. Just, "You missed a spot," and the sound of the soda can opening and Shanice walking back out. Raina turned around. She set the dish she was holding down very carefully on the counter and she looked at the doorway her sister had just walked through and she said, quietly but with a steadiness that was new, "Shanice. Don't talk to me like that." There was a pause. Then the sound of Shanice's footsteps coming back. "Excuse me," Shanice said. Her voice had that particular tone that belonged to people who had never once been checked in their lives, a tone of pure bewilderment that someone would dare. "I said don't talk to me like that," Raina said. "I'm not your maid. I'm not anybody's maid. I cleaned this entire kitchen and the only thing you could say is that I missed a spot." Shanice's face changed. And then she did the thing that Raina had always known she would eventually do, she called for their mother. "Mom. Raina's going off on me for no reason." And within 30 seconds, Gloria appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing her work shoes, still carrying the weight of a long day on her face, and she looked at the two of them and without asking a single question, without taking a single breath to understand what had actually happened, she said the sentence that she had said so many times it had become reflex, the sentence that was the distilled essence of everything wrong with how this family was structured. She pointed her finger at Raina and said, "Don't you dare come at your sister. Do you hear me? Don't you dare." The kitchen went completely still. Destiny appeared in the doorway behind Gloria and watched with wide eyes. And Raina, who had been holding something back for 16 years, who had been patient and capable and invisible and quiet and expected to act like the oldest, looked at her mother and said, slowly and very clearly, "She walked into this kitchen after I'd been cleaning it for an hour and told me I missed a spot. And you're defending her. You didn't ask me a single question. You didn't even look at what I was doing. You just came in and took her side. You always take their side. You have taken their side my whole life, Mom. My whole life." Gloria stared at her. Something moved across her face, a flash of something that might have been recognition, might have been guilt, and then it was gone, replaced by the expression Raina had seen 100 times, the expression that said the conversation was over. You need to check your attitude, Gloria said. I don't know who you think you're talking to. And she turned around and walked back out of the kitchen. Shanice looked at Raina one more time, a look of complete untouchable satisfaction, the look of someone who knows they will always win, and followed their mother. Destiny lingered in the doorway for a moment, her face unreadable, and then she too disappeared. Raina stood alone in the kitchen. The dishwater was going cold. One of the pots was still half-washed. The overhead light hummed softly. She stood there for a long time and she thought about her English teacher, Mrs. Dunmore, telling her she had something in her that most people don't develop until much later. She thought about the piece of paper she had folded up inside herself, the compliment, the encouragement, the only real recognition of her worth she had ever received from another human being. And she made a decision. Not loudly. Not with drama or announcement. Just quietly, the way all the most important decisions in a person's life actually get made, in ordinary rooms, in ordinary moments, when something finally becomes clear that cannot be made unclear again. She went to the bedroom. She pulled a duffel bag from the top of the closet. And she packed it. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything. One full change of clothes. A second outfit. Her toothbrush. The small notebook where she had been writing things down since she was 10, observations, feelings, ideas, things she'd read that she wanted to remember. Her birth certificate, which she had found 2 years earlier in the bottom drawer of Gloria's dresser and quietly taken and kept, some part of her knowing even then that she might one day need it. $28 she had saved over 3 months from collecting bottles and returning them to the store down the block, $1 here, $2 there, the most patient and unglamorous form of savings imaginable. And the last thing she put in the bag was a photograph. It was the only photograph she had ever found of herself and her mother where both of them were smiling. She was 2 years old in the picture, sitting on Gloria's lap on the front porch, and Gloria had her arms around her and they were both looking at the camera and it was real, not performed, not stiff, they were genuinely happy in that moment. She kept that photo not because she believed in what it represented anymore, but because she needed to hold on to the evidence that it had existed. That even if just for a fraction of her life, her mother had looked at her like she was worth holding. She left the house at 4:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was completely dark except for the orange glow of the streetlight on the corner. She stood on the porch for exactly 1 minute, breathing in the air, listening to the sound of a world that was asleep and had no idea what was happening on this step. Then she walked down the block without looking back, her duffel bag on one shoulder, $28 in the front pocket of her jeans, and nothing ahead of her that she could see. She was 16 years old. She was entirely alone. And the people she was leaving behind would not come looking. Let that land for a moment. A 16-year-old girl, walking away from her home in the dark, with $28 and a duffel bag, and not one person in that house would come to find her. Gloria filed a police report 3 days later, not because she was desperate with fear, but because someone told her she had to. The officer came, wrote things down, gave her a number to call. She called it once. After that, the report gathered dust the way reports do when nobody is truly pushing. And life in the Holt house, freed from the person who had been doing half the work inside it, adjusted slowly and messily, the way a household adjusts when it loses its most capable member. The dishes piled. The floors went unswept. Responsibilities that had been invisible because Raina was handling them suddenly became visible because nobody else was. And Shanice and Destiny complained about it, and Gloria eventually redistributed the work, and within a few weeks the house had a new normal. Raina's name was said less and less. And eventually, in the specific cruelty of daily life that moves forward regardless of who it leaves behind, her name stopped being said at all. She made it to the Greyhound station by 5 in the morning and bought a ticket to Charlotte, North Carolina, with 15 of her $28, because Charlotte was the farthest she could get for that price and she needed to be far. She sat in the back of the bus with her duffel bag on her lap and watched Atlanta slide away behind her in the gray pre-dawn light, the skyline shrinking in the rear window until it was just a collection of shapes and then nothing at all. She felt nothing for most of that ride. Not grief, not relief, not fear, just a strange internal blankness, like a screen that had been displaying static for so long it had gone to black. Somewhere past the state line she fell asleep. She woke up in Charlotte as the bus was pulling into the station, a thin gray morning outside the windows, the smell of diesel and unfamiliar air coming through the door when it opened. She stepped off the bus with $13 in her pocket and no plan whatsoever. The first 2 nights in Charlotte she slept in the bus station. She sat upright in the plastic chairs and kept her bag between her feet and dozed in short intervals, waking at every sound. She was hungry by the end of the first day, but she was afraid to spend any of her $13 because she didn't know how long it would have to last. A woman in her 50s who worked the cleaning shift at the station, a round woman named Miss Bev with a no-nonsense face and tired eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, noticed Raina on the second night and sat down across from her during her break. "How old are you?" she asked. Raina said 17, for the same reason children always add a year when they are trying to avoid being managed, to seem old enough to handle themselves. Miss Bev looked at her for a long moment and then reached into her bag and handed her a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a folded piece of paper with an address written on it. "Youth shelter on Davidson Street," she said. "They take walk-ins until 10 at night. Go tomorrow. Don't wait." Then she got up and went back to work. She didn't ask Raina's name. She didn't ask why she was there. She just saw a child sitting alone in a bus station in the middle of the night and did the specific, uncomplicated thing that needed to be done. Raina ate that sandwich slowly in the dark of the bus station and she cried for the first time since she had left home. Not big dramatic crying, quiet crying, the kind that comes from exhaustion and relief and the unexpected shock of a stranger's kindness. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let it come and then let it stop. And then she lay her head against her duffel bag and slept better than she had in 2 days. The shelter on Davidson Street became home for the next 4 months. It was run by a nonprofit called New Path, and it housed 12 young people at a time, teenagers and young adults, all of them carrying some version of the same story in different details. Some were fleeing abuse. Some had aged out of foster care. Some, like Raina, had simply reached the point where staying was no longer survivable. The director was a man named Calvin Reese, a 50-something black man with enormous hands and a voice that went low and calm when things got hard, the way certain people's voices do, the people who have learned that softness is a form of control. He ran the shelter like it was a serious place with serious expectations, curfew at 9, chores assigned on a rotating schedule, mandatory participation in the weekly life skills group sessions. Raina, who had been running her own internal life skills program since she was 8 years old, took to the shelter structure immediately. She was up before the mandatory wake-up time. She did her assigned chores and often did additional ones without being asked. Within 3 weeks, 2 of the other residents had started calling her Captain, not mockingly, but with the genuine respect that people extend to someone who simply handles things without complaint. But underneath the functioning, underneath the early mornings and the reliable performance of all the things that were expected of her, Raina was also carrying something that she had not yet dealt with. She was hungry most of the time, not because the shelter didn't feed its residents, it did, but because her body had been running on so much adrenaline for so many weeks that it didn't know how to register fullness. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding themselves together by sheer will for so long that the muscles of their resolve were simply worn through. There were nights she lay on her cot in the room she shared with 3 other girls, listening to the sounds of the street outside, and the weight of everything she had left and everything she didn't have ahead of her would press down on her chest so hard she had to breathe deliberately just to keep it from closing in. She didn't talk about those nights to anyone. She held them privately the way she had learned to hold everything, carefully, quietly, alone. Calvin Reese noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything, not with intrusion but with the specific attentiveness of someone who has watched enough young people fall through cracks to understand the difference between a person who is okay and a person who is performing okay. He started leaving books on her cot. Not textbooks, not instructional materials, stories, biographies, memoirs of people who had navigated impossible circumstances and found their way through. He left a copy of a book about a woman who had grown up in poverty, made her way to college, and eventually built an organization that served thousands of people. He left a book about a man who had lost everything in his 20s and rebuilt from absolute zero. He left these books without comment or explanation, and Raina read every single one of them, usually finishing them in 2 or 3 days, and when she was done she would leave them on his desk and he would look up and nod, and that was the entirety of the exchange. But those books were doing something to her internally that nothing else had reached. They were building a vocabulary for what she was experiencing, a language for survival, for starting over, for understanding that what had happened to her was not a reflection of her value but of her family's failure. She was absorbing that language word by word, and it was becoming structural. It was becoming part of how she held herself up. After 4 months at the shelter, Raina aged into the maximum residency period. Calvin helped her apply for a transitional housing program for young adults aging out of the shelter system. She was approved. The apartment was a single room in a supervised residence, small, spare, a window that looked out onto an alley, a radiator that knocked all winter. She moved in with her duffel bag and the pile of books Calvin had given her and a second-hand blanket from the shelter's donation pile. She found a job within a week, washing dishes at a diner 3 blocks away for $8 an hour. She worked 5 days a week, doubled up on weekends when they'd give her extra hours, and lived on the staff meal she ate at the diner and the cheapest possible groceries she could buy at the end of each week. She was 17 years old and she was living alone in a city where she knew no one, and she was doing it. Not gracefully. Not without cost. But she was doing it. Every Friday she walked to the bank 2 blocks from the diner and deposited a portion of her week's wages. The teller, a young woman named Angela, started greeting her by name after the 3rd visit. "There's Raina," she'd say. And Raina would hand over her deposit slip and feel something small but real move through her chest. The specific feeling of being recognized. Of being known in a place by a person who expected you to show up. It sounds like nothing. But when you have come from where she came from, it sounds like everything. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story, because what happens next is where everything begins to change. Raina enrolled in a GED program at the Community Education Center 4 blocks from the transitional residence. She went every weekday morning before her afternoon shift at the diner. Her instructor was a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, a Nigerian-American woman in her late 40s who wore her natural hair pinned up and had the particular brisk efficiency of someone who respects both her students' time and their intelligence. Dr. Okafor graded essays with a red pen that she used generously and commented in the margins with a directness that some students found harsh. Raina found it clarifying. In the 3rd week of the program, Dr. Okafor handed back an essay Raina had written about overcoming adversity and said in front of the entire class, without fanfare or softness, "This is what this assignment was supposed to look like. This is the standard." It was the closest thing to public recognition Raina had received since Mrs. Dunmore in 7th grade, and something about it hitting her in that room full of other struggling young people made it different. Made it feel earned in a way that nothing given out of pity could ever feel. She earned her GED 4 months later. Dr. Okafor shook her hand in the hallway afterward and said, "Don't stop. Whatever you do next, don't stop." Raina said she wouldn't. She meant it with everything she had. She was 18 years old with a GED, a dishwashing job, and a savings account that had been growing slowly, stubbornly, for just over a year. She enrolled in night classes at Central Piedmont Community College, paying for the first semester out of pocket, a sacrifice that meant eating instant noodles 4 nights a week and walking to campus instead of taking the bus to save the fare. She was studying business administration, not because she had some specific corporate dream at that point, but because business felt like the most direct path toward understanding how the world actually worked, how money moved, how organizations functioned, how people with nothing built things from the ground up. And the more she studied, the more she understood that she was already operating with an intuition for it. She had been running a household efficiently since she was 9 years old. She had been managing limited resources, time, energy, money, with the discipline of someone who knew that waste was a luxury she could not afford. What she was learning in those classrooms was the formal language for what she already knew how to do. And that understanding was electric. Her first real break came through the diner. The owner was a man named Frank Guidry, a heavy-set, direct-spoken man from Louisiana who had owned the diner for 20 years and ran it with the organized stubbornness of someone who knows exactly what they have and how they want it run. He noticed Raina in the way that good business owners notice employees who operate differently, not just doing their job, but thinking about their job. She had reorganized the dishwashing station without being asked in a way that cut the post-dinner cleanup time by 40 minutes. She had noticed that the supply deliveries were coming on days that conflicted with the heaviest service hours and had quietly rearranged the delivery schedule by calling the supplier herself. She had done these things not to impress anyone but because the inefficiency bothered her and she couldn't leave it alone. Frank Guidry called her into his office one afternoon and asked her who she was and where she had come from and whether she had ever thought about working front of house. She hadn't, particularly. But she said yes. Within 6 months she was his most reliable server. Within a year she was managing the morning shift. Within 2 years she was effectively running the diner's daily operations while Frank handled the finances and the supplier relationships. He paid her accordingly. Not generously, Frank Guidry was a businessman, but fairly. And fairly was enough for Raina, because fairly was something she could build on. She transferred her credits to UNC Charlotte and completed her bachelor's degree in business administration over 4 years of night classes. She graduated on a Thursday morning in May, sitting in the auditorium in a rented gown with her hands folded in her lap, and when her name was called she walked across that stage and shook the dean's hand and received her diploma and did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had saved her tears for private moments and this was a public moment and she wanted to inhabit it fully, with her eyes open and her back straight and her chin up, because this moment belonged entirely to her. Nobody had helped her get here. Nobody had subsidized this journey or cushioned its edges or shown up at the end of a hard week with encouragement and support. She had done this the way she had done everything in her life, alone, incrementally, with the specific refusal to stop that had been the only constant in her life since she walked out of a house in Atlanta at 4:30 in the morning at 16 years old with $28 and a bag on her shoulder. After graduation, Frank Guidry offered her a partnership in the diner. She turned it down, not ungratefully, but because she had a different idea growing inside her. She had spent 2 years of her business degree studying supply chain management and logistics and she had come to understand that there was significant money to be made in the gap between small businesses and efficient distribution networks. Small businesses were underserved by large logistics companies because their volumes weren't big enough to be profitable at scale. But if you aggregated them, if you built a network that could handle multiple small clients under a single operational umbrella, the economics changed completely. It was an idea she had been developing in notebooks for 18 months. She laid it out on paper the way she laid everything out, methodically, completely, with every assumption identified and every number checked twice. Then she took that plan to a small business development center she had found through the community college and presented it to a program officer named Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 38 years old and had reviewed hundreds of business plans in his career, and he later said that Raina Holt's plan was in the top 5 he had ever seen, not because it was the most sophisticated, but because every single number was grounded in research and every single assumption was conservative. She had planned for things to go wrong, he said. Most first-time entrepreneurs plan for things to go right. She planned for everything. He connected her with a small business loan and a mentorship program, and within 6 months she had her first 3 clients. Within a year she had 8. Within 3 years she had a staff of 7 and had moved out of the studio apartment she'd been renting into a proper office space in a shared commercial building. Within 5 years, Holt Logistics Solutions was operating across the Southeast with contracts in 4 states and annual revenue crossing $3 million. Within 8 years, she had 43 employees, a fleet of contracted carriers, and a reputation in the regional logistics industry as someone who operated with absolute reliability and complete transparency, someone whose word meant something, always. Within 10 years, she had crossed the threshold into a life that would have been literally unrecognizable to the 16-year-old girl standing in the dark on a Charlotte sidewalk with $13 in her pocket. She drove a car that cost more than the house she grew up in. She wore clothes that she bought without calculating whether she could afford them. She had a home with enough rooms that she could close a door and sit in silence when she needed to, which she valued more than almost anything because silence had been a luxury she'd never had as a child. In the Holt house there was always noise, always someone else's drama filling every available space. She had a savings account that represented a level of security so far beyond anything she had grown up around that she sometimes sat and looked at the number on the screen and had to remind herself that it was real. She sat on the board of a nonprofit in Charlotte that provided transitional housing for young people aging out of the shelter system, the same system that had once given her a bed and a chance when she had nothing else. She funded 2 annual scholarships for GED students through the community college. She was not yet 30 years old and she had built, from $28 and a duffel bag, a life that was entirely her own in every sense of the word. And yet, there is a yet in every story of this kind, and here is Raina Holt's. For all of it, for everything she had built and everything she had become, there was a door inside her that had never fully closed. The door to the house in Atlanta. To the kitchen with the overhead light humming. To her mother's face in the doorway, finger pointed, voice hard. To Shanice's look of untouchable satisfaction. To the weight of 16 years of being the invisible one, the capable one, the one who handled things while everyone else got to simply exist. She had done the work. Lord, she had done the work. Years of therapy with a woman named Dr. Carla Simmons, a quiet, unhurried therapist who had the specific gift of asking the one question that cracked everything open. She had cried in that office in ways she had never allowed herself to cry anywhere else. She had sorted through what was hers to own and what had been done to her without her consent. She had arrived, slowly and honestly, at a place of understanding that Gloria Holt was not simply a cruel woman but a damaged one, a woman who had never been taught how to love all her children equally because she herself had never been fully loved, and who had passed that wound down the line the way wounds get passed when nobody treats them. Understanding didn't erase the pain. But it changed the shape of it. It went from a wound that bled to a scar that ached in certain weather. Livable. Contained. But present. Dr. Carla Simmons was the one who finally said it. Not during their regular session, she said it at the end of a session, right as Raina was putting her coat on, in that specific way that the most important things sometimes get said, casually, as though they are afterthoughts when they are actually the whole point. She said, Raina. You've built everything. You've healed more than most people ever do. But there is one chapter of your story that is still open. What are you going to do about that? Raina knew exactly what she meant. She stood at the office door with her coat half on and she looked at her therapist and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I don't know yet. Dr. Simmons said, when you know, you'll know. And when you know, go. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table in her house in Charlotte and she thought about it for a long time. She thought about what it would mean to go back. Not to fix anything. Not to receive an apology that might never come in the form she needed it to come. Not even to show them what she had become, though she would be lying if she said that impulse was completely absent, because she was human, and she had been told for 16 years that she was nothing, and part of her wanted the people who had said it to see who they had been wrong about. But underneath that, deeper than it, truer than it, was something else. The knowledge that she was not free. Not completely. Not while that chapter remained open. And that freedom, real freedom, required finishing things. Required walking back through the door. Choosing what to do when she got there. On her own terms. She made the decision on a Sunday evening in October, 11 years after she had left. She called her assistant and asked her to arrange 2 vehicles for the following Saturday. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. She called her closest friend, a woman named Cassandra who had known her for 6 years and had walked beside her through enough of the hard parts of this journey to understand without needing details. She said, "I'm going back to Atlanta on Saturday. I'd like you to come." Cassandra said, "I'll be there." And then Raina sat down and wrote a check. The amount was enough to cover her mother's mortgage for 12 months. She had done some quiet research and learned that Gloria was 3 months behind on payments, that the house was at risk. She wrote the check slowly and deliberately, and she sat looking at it for a moment when she was done. She was not writing it because her mother had earned it. She was not writing it as a reward for the way she had raised her oldest daughter. She was writing it because she had decided, through years of therapy and reflection and the long process of becoming someone she was proud of, that she was going to be a person who helped, even when helping was hard, even when the person being helped was the source of some of the deepest pain in her life. Because the alternative, holding it, carrying the debt of what they owed her, required her to stay in the same room with the past for the rest of her life. And she was done living there. On Saturday morning she woke at 5 and dressed carefully. A cream blazer over a deep burgundy blouse. Heels she could walk in. Her hair pulled back and clean. She looked in the mirror for a long moment, not with vanity but with intention. She was looking at the woman she had made out of the girl they had discarded. She wanted to see her clearly before she drove back to the place that had tried to unmake her. Cassandra arrived at 7. The 2 vehicles were already waiting, Raina's company SUV, black and understated, and the second vehicle she had arranged for this particular day, because she had thought carefully about what this return should look like and she had decided that it should not be small. She had spent 11 years building something real. She had not done that so she could slip back into Atlanta like an apology. She was going back as who she was, not who they had wanted her to be. The second vehicle was a Rolls-Royce, white and gleaming, arranged through a premium car service that catered to corporate events. She had never rented a Rolls-Royce in her life and she would never do it again. She was not a person who needed that kind of display for herself. But for this moment, for this specific return to this specific street, she wanted the statement to be impossible to misread. She had been told she was nothing. She wanted the neighborhood, and the people inside that house, to understand with absolute clarity what nothing had become. The 2 vehicles left Charlotte at 7:30 in the morning. 4 hours south on the highway, the Atlanta skyline appeared ahead of them. Raina sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce as it moved through the city toward the East Side neighborhood where she had spent the first 16 years of her life, and she looked out the window at streets she had not seen in over a decade. Things had changed and things had not changed. A new development where a parking lot used to be, the same dollar store on the same corner, a newer sign on the gas station but the same gas station. The city remembered her even if the city did not know her. They turned onto her old block at 11:45 in the morning. The SUV went first. And then the Rolls-Royce followed. Slow. Deliberate. Moving through that narrow residential street with the specific unhurried certainty of something that knows it belongs exactly where it is. The reaction was immediate. A man washing his car at the curb stopped mid-spray and turned. 2 women sitting on a porch down the block stood up from their chairs. A group of teenagers on the corner went completely quiet and watched. A child on a bicycle stopped pedaling and put one foot down on the ground and stared. Curtains moved in windows all down the block. Within 90 seconds of that convoy turning the corner, there were people out of their houses, standing on porches and stoops and sidewalks, doing the thing that neighborhoods do when something they cannot immediately classify demands their attention. They gathered. They talked. They pointed. They said to each other, "Who is that?" and "Did somebody in this neighborhood make it like that?" and "Which house are they going to?" And when both vehicles came to a stop in front of the third house from the corner, the one with the slightly peeling pale yellow paint and the old oak tree whose roots were lifting the sidewalk, the crowd that had assembled on both sides of the street understood that something significant was about to happen on this block. They just didn't know what. Raina sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce for 2 full minutes. She breathed. The sounds of the neighborhood came through the slightly cracked window, someone's music from a house nearby, a child calling out, the distant bark of a dog. She looked at the house. The chipped front steps. The oak tree that had grown enormous. The curtain in the front window that had just moved. She reached into her jacket pocket and touched the photograph she had carried with her for 11 years, herself at 2 years old, on her mother's lap, both of them genuinely smiling in the sun. She touched it through the fabric and then she opened the car door and stepped out. She stood on that sidewalk in the October sun, in her cream blazer and her heels, with her back straight and her chin level, and the street that had gathered around her went so quiet that the sound of her heels on the pavement as she walked toward the house was the only sound anyone could hear. She had taken 4 steps toward the front door when it opened. Gloria was standing in the doorway. She must have seen the cars from the window, must have been watching as the convoy came down her street, must have felt some instinctive knowledge that whatever was coming specifically for her house. She was 61 years old now. Reyna had done the math on the drive down, and she looked every one of those years and then some. Her hair was fully gray and cut short. She was wearing a house dress and had her arms crossed loosely over her chest, which was the posture of a woman who was bracing herself for something she could not yet name. And then Reyna got close enough for their eyes to meet. And Gloria Holt, the woman who had stood in kitchen doorways for 16 years and pointed her finger and told her oldest daughter that she needed to check her attitude, the woman who had not searched for her child when she disappeared, the woman who had chosen her younger daughters over her firstborn so many times it had become the defining architecture of that family. Gloria Holt looked at Reyna and her arms dropped to her sides and her mouth opened and she made no sound. Nothing came out. She just looked. And in that look, in the specific quality of silence in that look, was everything that could never be adequately said. Recognition. Shock. Something that the body does when it confronts a truth it has been avoiding for so long that confronting it feels physical, like a blow that lands slow. Gloria's hand came up and pressed against her own chest. Not dramatically. Just instinctively. Like she needed to check that her heart was still there. Reyna walked up those chipped front steps. She stood on the porch in front of her mother. They were the same height now. Reyna had grown another inch after she left. They looked at each other from a distance of 4 feet and a distance of 11 years and all the distance that had been inside that distance, and neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Reyna said, simply, "Hi, Mom." 2 words. Quiet. Not cold, not warm, something more deliberate than either. Her mother said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far down inside her, "Reyna." Just her name. Nothing else. And then Shanice appeared behind Gloria in the doorway, 30 now, a little fuller in the face, wearing jeans and a hoodie, her mouth falling open when she saw who was standing on the porch. And behind Shanice was Destiny, 27 years old, who covered her mouth with both hands immediately, whose eyes filled up instantly in the way of someone for whom emotion lives close to the surface. There were all 4 Crawford women, all 4 Holt women, on the porch and in the doorway of the house in Atlanta at 11:55 in the morning on a Saturday in October, while a neighborhood full of people watched from sidewalks and porches and windows, quietly, because something was happening here that you do not interrupt. Reyna looked at her mother and said, "Can we talk inside?" And Gloria stepped back and Reyna walked through the front door of the house that she had last walked through at 4:30 in the morning 11 years ago going the other direction, and the smell of the house hit her the way smells always hit you when you return to somewhere deep in your past. It was the same smell, completely unchanged. The specific combination of her mother's laundry detergent and old wood and something she could not name that was simply the smell of having grown up here. And it landed in her body before her mind had time to process it, and for one involuntary second she was 8 years old again and standing in the hallway outside the kitchen watching her mother braid Shanice's hair. She let that second pass through her. Then she walked into the kitchen. They sat at the table. All 4 of them. Cassandra stayed outside, which is what Reyna had asked of her. This part needed to happen without witnesses who were on her side. The kitchen was mostly the same, different curtains, a newer refrigerator, but the same table. The same 4 chairs. Raina placed her hands flat on the table and she looked at her mother, who was sitting directly across from her with her hands in her lap and her eyes down. Shanice sat to the right, her arms crossed, her face a complex mixture of emotions that she was clearly not sure what to do with. Destiny sat to the left and was already crying, silently, tears moving steadily down her face, not trying to stop them. The room was so quiet you could hear the refrigerator hum. The same refrigerator hum. The same kitchen. A completely different moment than any that had ever happened in it before. Raina spoke first. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I'm not here to tear anything apart or to make anyone feel worse than they already might feel. I want to say some things and I want you to hear them without interrupting me. Can you do that?" Gloria nodded. Her eyes were still down. "What happened in this house when I was growing up was not fair," Raina said. Her voice was steady. Not loud, not strained, steady with the specific steadiness of something that has been prepared a long time. "I was a child in this house and I was treated differently from the beginning and I never understood why. I still don't fully understand why. I was the oldest. I worked harder than anyone in this family and I received less than anyone in this family. I was mocked by my sisters and when I defended myself you came in and took their side every single time. Every single time, Mom. I was 16 years old when I left and I left because staying was destroying something in me that I couldn't afford to lose." She paused. The refrigerator hummed. Destiny pressed her hand to her mouth. "I spent the first 2 years after I left not eating enough. I slept in a bus station. I begged, and I mean that, Mom, I stood outside a convenience store in Charlotte, North Carolina, and asked strangers for money for food. I was 17 years old. Your daughter was standing outside a store asking strangers for food because she couldn't stay in her own home." Gloria made a sound, small, involuntary, like something inside her had given way. She pressed her knuckles to her lips and her eyes, which had been down, came up and looked at Raina and filled with tears that she didn't try to stop. "I'm not telling you that to hurt you," Raina said. "I'm telling you because you should know. You should know what happened to your daughter after she left. Because nobody called to find out. Nobody came. I disappeared from this family and this family kept going." She took a breath. "I built a life. I want you to know that, not to brag, but because I want you to understand what I was capable of when I wasn't spending all my energy trying to survive being invisible in my own home. I built a real company. I have people who work for me. I have a home my own. I have a life that is mine in every way that matters. And I built it from nothing. From less than nothing. From $28 and a duffel bag and 11 years of refusing to give up on myself even when everything was telling me I should." She reached into her jacket and placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward her mother. "That's a check. It's enough to cover 12 months of your mortgage. I know you're behind on payments. I found out. I'm not giving you that because you earned it. I'm giving you that because I have decided that I am not going to be someone who withholds help when I have the ability to help. That is the kind of person I have chosen to be. And I'm choosing it even here. Even with you." Gloria looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she looked up at Raina and said, in a voice that was barely holding itself together, "I am so sorry, Raina. I am so sorry." And for the first time in Raina Holt's life, she heard her mother say those words without qualification, without a pivot, without a follow-up that shifted the weight of the apology onto someone else. Just the words, plain and direct and trembling. "I know I did wrong by you. I knew it then too. I don't have an excuse. I knew it and I didn't change it and you left and you never came back and I told myself you were fine. I told myself you had made your choice." She stopped. Her voice was gone. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed carefully, the way older people breathe when they are trying not to come completely undone. "I lied to myself," she said. "I knew you weren't fine. I didn't know how to go back." She looked at her oldest daughter across 11 years and a kitchen table. I didn't know how to go back. There was a silence. A long one. Shanice, who had not spoken a word since Raina sat down, uncrossed her arms and put her hands flat on the table, mirroring without realizing it what Raina had done at the beginning. She said, Raina, I was really mean to you when we were kids. I knew what I was doing. Some of it, I knew. She stopped. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The truth of it was already in the room. Destiny was crying openly now, not quietly anymore. She said, I didn't know. I really didn't know. I was little and I thought that was just how things were. I didn't know what it was costing you. I swear I didn't. Raina looked at Destiny and something in her face softened, just slightly, just briefly. I know you didn't, Destiny, she said. You were a little kid. That's not on you. She paused. It's on the people who should have known better. She looked at her mother. And then she said the thing she had driven 4 hours to say. The thing that had taken 11 years and countless hours in a therapist's chair and more silent reckonings than she could count to arrive at. She said it clearly, looking directly at her mother's face. I forgive you, Mom. Not because this was okay. It wasn't okay. Not because the pain wasn't real. It was real and it still is, sometimes. But I am not going to carry it anymore. I am not going to spend the rest of my life being defined by what happened in this house. I am releasing it. I am releasing you. And I am taking myself back. She stood up from the table. The kitchen was completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The refrigerator hummed. The sound of the neighborhood came through the window, someone's radio, children playing, a car passing slowly. All of it ordinary, all of it indifferent to what was happening inside this room, which is the way the world always is when something enormous happens in a kitchen with 4 women sitting at a table. Raina looked at Shanice. She didn't hug her. She didn't extend warmth she didn't have. But she looked at her directly and said, I hope you do better. I mean that. Shanice nodded. Her eyes were red. She said, I will. And Raina believed her enough to let it stand. She looked at Destiny and opened her arms, and Destiny stood up immediately and came into them and held on, and Raina held on too, briefly but genuinely, the way you hold on to a person when the thing between you is complicated but the love underneath it is real in its own complicated way. She looked at her mother last. Gloria had not moved from her chair. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her face open and devastated and old and honest in a way Raina had never seen her face before. Raina looked at her for a long moment. And then she walked around the table and she put her hand on her mother's shoulder, not a hug, not an embrace that promised more than she had, just a hand. A touch that said, I was here. I am here. You see me now. It is too late for much, but this moment is real. Gloria's hand came up and covered Raina's and held it, and they stayed like that for just a second, and it was the closest thing to the mother and daughter they had never been allowed to be, offered here at the end of the story instead of the beginning. Late. Incomplete. But present. And presence, as Raina had learned in 11 years of building a life from nothing, is not nothing. Presence is the whole thing. She walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, past the spot in the hallway outside the kitchen door where she had stood as an 8-year-old watching her mother braid Shanice's hair. She walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch and looked at the neighborhood. The neighbors were still there, most of them, the ones who had given up on pretending they weren't watching. They stood on their porches and their sidewalks in the October afternoon, watching this woman in the cream blazer and heels come out of that house and stand on that porch the way she was standing, calm, unhurried, complete. Some of them had grown up on this block with the Holt girls. Some of them knew. Some of them had watched Gloria's oldest daughter disappear a decade ago and had wondered occasionally what had happened to her. They were looking at what had happened to her. Cassandra was leaning against the SUV. She looked at Reina's face and she nodded once, the specific nod of someone who knows you and is satisfied with what they see. Reina walked down the chipped front steps for the last time. She walked across the sidewalk to the SUV. She got in. Cassandra got in beside her and didn't say anything. The driver, who had been standing quietly by the Rolls-Royce the entire time, walked around and got in, and both vehicles pulled away from the curb and moved slowly back down the block the way they had come. The neighbors watched them go. They stayed on their porches and their stoops and their sidewalks long after the cars had turned the corner and disappeared, talking among themselves, saying her name, telling and retelling what they had seen in the way that neighborhoods preserve the stories that matter to them. Reina sat in the back of the SUV on the drive back and she looked out the window at Atlanta going past and she didn't say much. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the photograph, the one she had carried for 11 years, herself at 2 years old on her mother's lap, both of them smiling in the sun. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the window 2 inches and held the photograph in her hand in the rushing air. For a moment she thought she might let it go. But she pulled it back. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Not because she needed to hold on to the pain. But because that little girl in the photograph, the 2-year-old sitting in her mother's lap in the sun, the one who did not yet know what was coming, deserved to be kept. She had survived everything. She had made it to the other side. She deserved to be carried forward. Holt Logistics Solutions now employs over 200 people. Reina sits on 3 nonprofit boards, including the Transitional Housing Organization in Charlotte, where she has funded the renovation of an entire residential wing. Every year she awards 4 scholarships to young people who, in the language of the application, have overcome significant family adversity to pursue their education. The applications she reads herself. She has never publicly talked about her childhood. She has never used her story for marketing or inspiration content or any of the things that the modern world tends to do with stories of overcoming. She keeps it close. She lives with it privately, the way she has lived with most important things, carefully, on her own terms, without asking anyone else's permission to define what it means. She goes to therapy once a month now. Not weekly, monthly. More maintenance than excavation. Dr. Simmons asked her once, about 6 months after the Atlanta trip, what that day had felt like. Reina thought about it for a while before answering. She said, "It felt like I picked up something very heavy that I had been carrying for 30 years and I set it down. And then I walked away from it. And when I looked back over my shoulder, I could still see it there. But I was not carrying it anymore. That was the difference." She paused. "I'm still not carrying it," she said. "That's the part that still surprises me. I thought setting it down would be the hard part. The hard part turned out to be believing it was allowed to stay down." Dr. Simmons asked if she believed it now. Reina said, "Yes. I do." And she meant it. So here is where this story ends, and here is the question it leaves behind. Because this is not a simple story about a girl who suffered and became successful. Success is the easy part to celebrate and the least interesting part to examine. What is worth examining, what this story is really about, is the decision that Reina Holt made on a Saturday in October, when she could have done anything. She could have stayed in Charlotte. She could have kept the distance between herself and that house for the rest of her life and nobody would have blamed her. She could have gone back for revenge. Not violence, but the cold, satisfying kind, the kind where you simply show up in your Rolls-Royce and let the image do its work and drive away without a word and let them live with the weight of what they lost. She could have made them feel small. She had every right to. And she chose something harder than all of it. She chose to walk into that kitchen and sit at that table and say the truth out loud and then offer something she didn't have to offer, and then let it go. She chose freedom over satisfaction. She chose wholeness over the comfort of a held grudge. And that, not the company, not the car, not the buildings on her non-profit board, that is the thing she built that matters most. The thing you cannot photograph or fund or put on a balance sheet. The thing that only you can decide to build inside yourself, and only when you are ready, and only on your own terms. The question is, could you? If you had lived what she lived, 16 years of invisibility and mockery and unfair expectations, could you have walked back through that door and said what she said and put that check on the table and walked back out with your heart open? Could you have chosen that? Think about it honestly. Not the version of yourself you hope to be. The version of yourself you actually are right now, with everything you are carrying. What would you have done? If this story moved you, if any part of it touched something real in you, please leave a comment below right now and tell us what hit you hardest. Tell us whether you would have gone back. Tell us if this story reminded you of someone in your own life or something you have lived through yourself, because stories like Reina's only mean something when they connect with real people in real lives, and your comments and your honesty are what make this community what it is. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, a friend, a sister, someone who has been carrying the weight of being the invisible one in their family, share this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone is to let them know that someone else survived what they are going through. Not just survived, built something beautiful and free on the other side of it. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that right now. We put out stories that are meant to stay with you, stories that reflect something true about what people can endure and what people can choose, and we would love to have you here for every one of them. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end. That means something. We will see you in the next one.